There are certain kinds of betrayal that do not arrive wearing a mask. They come dressed in silk, perfumed and smiling, speaking in soft, practiced voices. They stand at the foot of your bed while you burn with fever, and instead of reaching for your hand, they reach for your keys. Thornfield Manor had stood for over 200 years on the green, rolling shoulders of the Virginia countryside. It had weathered revolutions and recessions, drought and mourning, but not a single storm in its long and proud history had stripped its walls of dignity, quite like the Tuesday afternoon in late October when the family of Duke Adrian Velcourt packed their trunks, ordered the carriages brought around, and left a dying man alone in his own bed. They told the remaining staff it was a contagion, something swift, something lethal, something that could sweep through a house and take every soul in it before the week was out. And so the fear did what fear always does. It emptied the place. Footmen and ladies' maids, the butler, the senior housekeeper vanished into the autumn mist one by one, until the grand manor was nothing but silence and the faint sound of labored breathing behind a closed mahogany door. All except one. Eleanor Carter did not leave. She was 21 years old, the daughter of a country schoolteacher, and she had been employed at Thornfield for just under 2 years as a chambermaid. She had no title, no fortune, no powerful name to protect her. What she had was something rarer, a conscience she could not silence, and a pair of hands she refused to keep folded in her lap while a man died alone. What happened next inside those walls would unravel a poisoning plot years in the making, expose a brother's treachery, bring a corrupt physician to justice, and light a fire between two people that neither of them expected and neither could extinguish. This is the story of what loyalty actually looks like, and what love looks like when it grows in the most unlikely soil. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Take a breath, because this one is going to take you somewhere. Thank you so much for being here. It truly means the world. Stories like this only reach the people who need them most when you help carry them forward. So if this story is already pulling at something in you, please hit that subscribe button right now. Smash that like for us, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from. We would genuinely love to say hello to you, because knowing how far the story is traveling is one of the most beautiful things about what we do here. Thank you. Now back to Thornfield. The first sign came at dinner. It was a Saturday. The manor was warm with candlelight and the smell of roasted rosemary chicken. Duke Adrian Velcourt sat at the head of the long dining table, 32 years old, and still with the kind of face that made people look twice. Dark eyes, strong jaw, the permanent tension of a man who carried too much and admitted none of it. He was young for a duke, having inherited the title 3 years prior after his father's death from a stroke, and he wore it the way a man wears a suit that was tailored for someone else. It fit, but not quite comfortably. His brother Edward sat to his left, animated as always, talking about some investment scheme in the city that he was convinced would triple his returns. Edward was 28, handsome in a shallow, rehearsed sort of way, with soft hands that had never done a full day's work and a laugh that sounded genuine until you heard it often enough to notice it never quite reached his eyes. Lady Beatrice sat across from Edward Adrian's wife of 4 years, elegant in ivory lace, her posture that of a woman who practiced it in a mirror. Beatrice had brought exactly 2 things to the marriage, an old family name and a talent for appearing devoted in public. In private, she and Adrian had not shared more than polite, corridor conversation in over a year. Eleanor was clearing the side credenza when it happened. She heard the silverware clatter a sharp, sudden sound and turned to find the Duke gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white, a tremor moving through his right hand that he could not seem to still. His face had gone pale beneath the candlelight, the color draining so fast that Eleanor set down the decanter she was holding without thinking. Adrian. Edward said his brother's name with more curiosity than alarm. You look awful. I am fine. Adrian said it quietly, in the tone of a man who had been saying he was fine for so long that it had become reflexive rather than truthful. He reached for his wine glass, but his hand missed it by an inch. He blinked as though surprised by his own body. He was not fine. By 10 that night, the fever had arrived not gradually but all at once, the way a summer storm breaks. Eleanor was in the upstairs hallway, returning a stack of pressed linens to the linen cupboard, when she heard Mrs. Helen, the elderly cook, call up from the bottom of the staircase in a voice that was half whisper and all terror. "Miss Carter, something is wrong with His Grace." The scene inside the master suite was alarming. Adrian lay on top of the bed covers, still fully dressed, his jacket thrown to the floor, his shirt damp and clinging. The tremors in his hands had spread to his arms. His eyes, when they opened, were unfocused, moving through the room as though searching for something solid to rest on. The abdominal pain had begun. Eleanor could tell from the way he pulled his knees slightly inward, not dramatically, not with complaint, but with the quiet, controlled effort of a man who refused to make a sound. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and pulled it away quickly. The heat radiating from his skin was staggering. "Send for Dr. Frederick," she said to Mrs. Helen, who stood in the doorway wringing her hands. "Tonight. Do not wait until morning." "But the hour. Now, please." Mrs. Helen disappeared. Eleanor stayed. She removed Adrian's shoes and his jacket with the efficient, unhurried movements of someone who had grown up watching her schoolteacher father tend to 6 students calmly and without fuss. She pulled the coverlet up. She brought a basin of cool water and laid a cloth across his brow. Adrian turned his head toward her. His eyes were clearer for a moment, a pocket of lucidity inside the fog. "You are the chambermaid." "Eleanor Carter, Your Grace." "Yes. Where is Beatrice?" Eleanor paused for only a fraction of a second. "I will let her know you are asking for her." She found Lady Beatrice in her dressing room, seated at her vanity, pins being removed from her hair by her personal maid. Eleanor informed her that the Duke was seriously unwell and that a physician had been sent for. Beatrice looked at her reflection in the mirror. "Is it serious?" "I believe so, my lady." A beat of silence. "Send word to Edward. He will know what to do." She did not rise from her chair. Eleanor returned to the master suite. She did not send word to Edward. She sat in the wooden chair beside Adrian's bed, and she did not leave. Dr. Frederick arrived at Thornfield on Sunday morning, sharp-featured and well-dressed, carrying a leather bag and an air of supreme professional self-importance that made the remaining staff instinctively step aside. He was the physician of choice for half of Virginia's wealthy families, celebrated, expensive, and accustomed to being trusted without question. He had small eyes that moved quickly and a mouth that rarely smiled, which people had mistaken for seriousness for so long that it had passed for wisdom. His examination of Adrian lasted approximately 9 minutes. Eleanor stood near the window and watched. She noticed that Dr. Frederick conducted most of the examination from a careful distance, listening to Adrian's chest without leaning too close, peering at his eyes with a glass, without actually touching his face. He asked a series of clipped questions and wrote his answers in a small notebook before he had finished receiving them. When he stepped into the corridor with Edward and Beatrice, Eleanor quietly positioned herself near the door, which had not been pulled fully shut. "It presents as a virulent fever with systemic involvement," she heard Dr. Frederick say in a low, measured voice. "Highly contagious. I cannot rule out transmission by contact. My strong recommendation is that the household be reduced immediately. Those who have not been exposed should vacate." "And those who have?" Edward asked. At this stage, the Duke's prognosis is uncertain. The silence that followed lasted no more than 4 seconds. Then Edward said, "I see. I will make arrangements." What Eleanor heard in those 4 seconds of silence, and in the tone of Edward's voice when he spoke again, was not grief. It was the sound of a man who had just received news he had been waiting for. The carriages were ordered within the hour. Edward framed it to the staff as an act of protection and orderly evacuation to prevent a household-wide outbreak. He spoke calmly and even generously, telling those who wished to leave that they would receive 2 weeks' wages and a reference letter. It was, by any measure, a masterclass in making abandonment sound like care. The effect was immediate. People who had served Thornfield for years were packing by noon. The butler, a man of 40 years' service, came to Eleanor with his hat in his hands and something that looked almost like shame in his eyes. "Miss Carter, are you coming?" "No." He blinked. "You understand that if this is what they say it is." "I understand perfectly," Eleanor said. "Safe travels to you." Mrs. Helen tried 3 separate times. The first, with practical argument. Eleanor had no immunity, no medical training, no good reason to stay. The second, with softer pleading. She was young. She had a future. She should not throw it away on a man who likely would not survive the week. The third time, just before Mrs. Helen herself climbed into the departing wagon, was with simple honesty. "Girl, you are going to be alone in that house with a dying man." "Then he will not be alone," Eleanor said. "That is the point." And here is where the story teaches its first quiet but important truth. Abandonment disguised as self-preservation is still abandonment. The fear of contagion was real, but the speed with which that fear was used to justify departure, without a single soul stopping to question the diagnosis, without a second opinion being sought, without a family member so much as sitting bedside for an hour, that was not self-preservation. That was a choice, a moral one. And every person in that manor on that Sunday afternoon made theirs. Eleanor made hers too. She walked back into the master suite, closed the door behind her, and got to work. By nightfall, Thornfield was nearly empty. The groundskeeper remained at his cottage on the property grounds. Mrs. Helen had, at the last moment, decided against departing after all, though she refused to go above the kitchen floor, citing her knees, her age, and a deep personal distrust of upper stories in times of crisis. And Eleanor, just Eleanor, in a house built for dozens, with a Duke burning in his bed. Dr. Frederick returned on the third day, Monday evening, just as the autumn light was fading from the windows. Adrian had deteriorated. The fever remained, stubborn and searing. The tremors came and went in waves, but it was the new symptoms that unsettled Eleanor, most a growing yellowness in the whites of his eyes, a burning pain in his throat that made him wince when he swallowed water, and a fatigue so deep it was more like sedation than sleep. She had been keeping careful mental notes, the way her father had taught her to observe, to record, to question. Dr. Frederick glanced at his patient from the doorway of the master suite, asked Eleanor 2 questions, one about fluid intake, one about temperature, and then produced from his bag a small dark glass vial, sealed with wax. 5 drops in a glass of water, he said, twice daily, morning and evening. Do not miss a dose. The consistency of the treatment is critical to its efficacy. What is in it? Eleanor asked. The question appeared to mildly offend him. He regarded her with the particular expression of a highly credentialed man being questioned by someone he considered unqualified to ask. It is a medicinal tincture, a proprietary formula designed to reduce systemic inflammation and purge the body's fever pathways. It is not your place to require a full chemical accounting, Miss Carter. Simply administer it as directed. He left, quickly, as he always seemed to. Eleanor stood alone in the master suite, holding the vial up to the bedside lamp. The liquid inside was dark, nearly black, and moved thickly when she tilted the glass. She uncorked it and held it to her nose. The smell hit her before she could fully prepare for it. Sweet, sharp, faintly metallic, and beneath it, something that pulled at the edges of a very old memory. Something from her childhood that her brain worked to place for a full 5 seconds before it surfaced. Her father's study. A book on her father's shelves is a medical text he kept alongside his teaching volumes, dog-eared and annotated in his small, precise handwriting. She had been perhaps 10 years old when she read it, drawn to it the way children are drawn to things they suspect are not entirely meant for them. There had been a chapter on poisoning, on arsenic, specifically used historically in paints, in wallpapers, in some agricultural compounds. Her father had underlined a passage that described its characteristic odor when concentrated. Sweet, slightly bitter, resembling almonds with a faint trace of garlic. Eleanor set the vial down on the nightstand very slowly. She touched the tip of one finger to the inside rim of the cork, barely a trace of liquid, and brought it to her lower lip. The bitterness was intense and immediate. She rinsed her mouth at once with the water pitcher on the nightstand and spat into the basin. And then she stood very still for a long moment, thinking. Arsenic poisoning. The symptoms matched with a precision that made her stomach cold. The tremors, the jaundiced eyes, the burning throat, the severe abdominal pain, the rapid onset. She thought about the way Dr. Frederick examined Adrian from a careful distance, not the caution of a man afraid of contagion. She now realized. but the composure of a man who already knew what was wrong and had no intention of curing it. She thought about the 4 seconds of silence in the corridor. She thought about Edward's voice. She thought about Edward's debts, which she had heard discussed in whispered fragments in the servants' hall over months, debts in the tens of thousands, gambling debts, the kind that didn't forgive. She thought about what happened to a younger brother's debts when his older brother died and the inheritance transferred. She picked up the vial. She walked to the window. She uncorked it, tipped it out over the sill into the dark garden below, and placed the empty vial in the pocket of her apron. She would need the evidence. She already understood that no one was going to believe her on her word alone. Now came the harder part, saving a man who was already being killed without anyone knowing she was trying. Eleanor went down to the kitchen, past the sleeping Mrs. Helen, out the back door with a lantern and a small gardening basket, into the cold October garden. She knew what to look for. Her father, the same man whose shelves had held that dog-eared medical text, had maintained a kitchen herb garden at their cottage all through her childhood, and had taught her to identify plants not just by sight, but by smell, by leaf, by season. She found milk thistle growing along the garden wall, its jagged leaves silvered in the lantern light. She found burdock root near the rear fence. She gathered a handful of fresh mint from the kitchen border. Back inside, she brewed 2 things simultaneously. A strong cleansing tea using the milk thistle and burdock, both historically known for supporting liver function and assisting the body in filtering toxic compounds, and a plain, mild peppermint broth that she could get past Adrian's swollen throat. This is worth pausing on, because it matters. Eleanor did not cure the Duke with magic or miracle. She applied what she knew with care, patience, and clear eyes. Milk thistle contains a compound called silymarin, which has been shown in studies to support liver cell regeneration and help the body process and eliminate certain toxic substances. It was used by healers for centuries, before modern medicine gave it a name. Eleanor did not know the science, but she knew the practice. And sometimes, knowledge passed hand to hand across generations is medicine in its own right. She returned to the master suite with both cups and set them on the nightstand. Adrian was half awake, the fever restless rather than still. "You need to drink this," she said. "Both of them, one at a time." He looked at the cups, then at her. "Did Frederick send more medicine?" "Dr. Frederick's medicine will not be continued," Eleanor said, in a tone that left no room for negotiation without being unkind. "This is something I have prepared. I need you to trust me." A long moment. The firelight moved across his face. "The girl who stayed," he said quietly. It was not quite a question. "Yes. All right," he said, and he drank. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of Eleanor Carter's life. Thornfield Manor in those days was a place outside of time, emptied of its usual sounds and purposes, stripped down to something essential. No footsteps on the stairs but hers. No voices in the corridors. Just the creak of the old house settling into the autumn cold, the sound of logs shifting in the fireplace of the master suite, and the slow, measured breathing of a man fighting his way back from the edge of something very dark. Eleanor ran a schedule with the precision of someone who understood that in the absence of organized care, chaos moves in. Morning, herbal tea, broth, temperature check, fresh linens. Midday, a light meal, reading aloud from whatever volume she selected from the library shelf she had wheeled to the doorway of the suite. Afternoon, rest, observation, another cup of milk thistle tea. Evening, the peppermint broth again. A lamp turned low, the chair pulled close. She slept in the armchair beside his bed for the first week, waking at every sound, every shift in his breathing, every creak of the floorboards that might mean something had changed. She was running for perhaps 4 hours a night, fueled by strong kitchen tea and what Mrs. Helen called, with considerable reluctance, the stubbornness of the very young. On the 4th day, the tremors eased slightly. On the 6th, the jaundice in his eyes began to fade. On the 9th day, he was well enough to sit upright without assistance, and his eyes were clear fully, steadily clear for the first time since the dinner table. He looked at Eleanor that morning with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the glassy half-recognition of a fevered man, not the polite, performative acknowledgement of an employer glancing at a servant. This was something direct and unguarded. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that has surprised them completely. "How long?" he asked. "9 days, Your Grace." He processed this in silence. Then, "Have they written? Edward or Beatrice?" "There have been 2 letters from Lord Edward, both addressed to Dr. Frederick. I did not read them." "Where are they?" "On your desk, untouched as they arrived." Another silence. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite anger, not quite sorrow. Something older than both. "And you," he said, "you have been here the entire time." "I have." "Why?" It was the question she had been expecting. She had thought about how to answer it honestly without burdening him, in his weakened state, with the full weight of what she suspected about the vial. She chose the truest version of a partial answer. "Because leaving felt like a choice I would have to live with for the rest of my life," she said, "and I decided I did not want that." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "Thank you, Miss Carter." It was the way he said it, without flourish, without the automatic grace of a nobleman performing gratitude, that told her he meant it all the way down. The days that followed built something neither of them had a name for. Eleanor continued her routines. Adrian, as his strength returned, began to participate in the hours rather than simply endure them. He started asking questions not about the estate, not about Edward's letters, not about his own position, but about her. Where had she grown up? What her father had taught? How she had known about the herbs? She answered carefully at first, then less carefully. She told him about the cottage in Western Virginia, the school her father had run from the front room, the way she had been educated alongside the students, simply because she was always present. She told him about her father's death when she was 17, the debts that followed, the choices that narrowed down one by one until Thornfield had been the open door. He listened the way few people of his station listened to people of hers, without waiting for a pause, to redirect the conversation back to himself. "You are not what I expected," he said one evening, when the fire had burned low and she was reading to him from a volume of American history, something he had specifically requested because he said it was the only subject that made him feel like the problems of his own life were appropriately small. "What did you expect?" she asked, marking her page. "I am not sure I was in the habit of expecting anything. From the household staff, I mean. I am ashamed of that now." The admission sat in the room between them, honest and unadorned. "Most people are not in the habit," Eleanor said. "That is how these things persist." He smiled at that, a real smile, the slightly wry kind that suited his face much better than the formal one, and Eleanor felt something shift very quietly inside her, like a door she had not known was closed swinging an inch ajar. She shut her book and stood up briskly. "You should sleep, Your Grace." "Of course," he said, but he was still smiling when she turned down the lamp. There is something worth understanding about what was growing in that room. It was not the fantasy of a maid falling for a duke, or a duke charmed by novelty. It was 2 people, stripped of their respective performances of authority, hers of invisibility, meeting each other plainly, in a place where the usual rules had stopped applying. Illness has a way of doing that. It removes the staging. And when the staging is gone, what remains is character. What remained, in this case, was a great deal of character on both sides. On the 12th day of Adrian's recovery, Eleanor found the ledger. She had gone to the study to retrieve a reference volume Adrian had requested from Financial Almanac. He wanted to cross-check against what he remembered of the estate accounts. The study was exactly as it had been left, tidy, undisturbed. Adrian's papers organized in the careful way of a man who trusted the ordering of his desk to settle something unsettled in his mind. She found the almanac on the second shelf, and wedged behind it, not hidden exactly, but not placed where anyone browsing would naturally look, a slim brown leather ledger with no name on the cover. She should have left it there. She knew that. She took it down. The ledger was written in a hand she did not recognize, small, precise, almost clinical. It took her only a few pages to understand what she was looking at. It was a record of payments, outgoing payments, spanning 3 years, each entry noted with a date, an amount, and a brief description. The descriptions were coded with nothing incriminating on their face, but the names were not coded. The name that appeared most frequently, as the recipient of a series of regular transfers from the estate accounts, was not a vendor or a creditor. It was Dr. Frederick's name. Eleanor sat down in the desk chair. She turned to the most recent entry. It was dated 4 days before Adrian's illness began. The amount was the largest in the ledger. The description beside it read, in the doctor's clipped, precise notation, "Final service, conclusive resolution." She sat with the ledger in her hands for a long time. Then she went to the fireplace, found the tin that held the estate's emergency correspondence supplies, wax, ribbon, clean paper, and wrote 2 letters in her careful schoolteacher-daughter handwriting. One addressed to the county sheriff's office, one addressed to the editor of the regional paper, whose name she had seen on a copy of the Gazette in the servants' reading room. She sealed both letters. She put them in her apron pocket alongside the empty vial. She returned the ledger to its exact position behind the almanac. She carried the almanac upstairs. "Did you find it?" Adrian asked when she returned to the suite. "I did," Eleanor said, "and something else as well." She set the almanac on the bed and then, for the first time, she told him everything. All of it. The smell of the vial, the recognition of arsenic, the disposal, the herbal tea, the evidence she had found in the study. She told it plainly, without softening it, without the kind of gentle framing that delays the landing of hard truth. She watched his face through all of it, the stillness, the controlled progression from disbelief to comprehension to something that was beyond anger, something colder and clearer. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted perhaps 30 seconds. "Edward," he said. It was not a question. "The ledger does not specify who directed Dr. Frederick, but the payments came from the estate accounts, which only Lord Edward had access to in your absence. He has had access to the accounts for 2 years, since I appointed him interim manager while I was overseeing the Durham holdings." A muscle moved in Adrian's jaw. "I gave him that access." "You trusted your brother," Eleanor said. "That is not a failing. The failure belongs to him." He looked at her then, and for a moment the composure cracked, just at the edges, a flash of something raw. Then it was gone, sealed back beneath the surface, and what replaced it was not bitterness, but resolve. "The letters," he said, "already written and sealed. I was waiting to know if you wished to review them before I sent them." He held out his hand. She gave them to him. He read both letters, made 3 small changes, resealed them, and handed them back. "Send them today," he said. "Both of them." Eleanor gave them to the groundskeeper, with instructions and a $2 coin, and they were in the postal box in the village by 3 that afternoon. She did not know it yet, but that was the moment the story stopped being a tragedy and started becoming something else entirely. Edward Velcourt arrived on a Friday morning, 16 days after he had departed, and he brought Dr. Frederick with him. He did not send word ahead. Eleanor suspected that was intentional. He expected to walk into a house containing a dead man and a handful of witnesses he could manage. What he was not prepared for was the door being opened by a chambermaid, who looked at him with the kind of steady, unimpressed calm that people only achieve when they know something the person in front of them does not yet know they know. "Lord Edward," Eleanor said, "and Dr. Frederick, please come in." Something flickered across Edward's face, a very brief hesitation. The house smelled of beeswax and something herbal. The floors were clean. There were fresh-cut garden branches in the hallway vase. None of this matched the picture he had been carrying in his mind for 16 days. "I have come to attend to the estate affairs," Edward said, with the automatic authority of a man accustomed to not being questioned, "and to make arrangements regarding my brother." "Of course," Eleanor said. "The Duke is expecting you." Edward stopped walking. He looked at Eleanor. "The Duke?" "Yes, my lord. He has been anticipating your visit. If you would follow me." She led them up the main staircase, through the wide corridor, and pushed open the doors of the master suite. Adrian was standing at the fireplace, not lying in bed, not feverish and fading, standing, dressed in a dark morning coat, his color restored, his posture straight, one arm resting on the mantelpiece with the ease of a man entirely at home in his own house. He looked, if anything, better than he had at that dinner table 16 days ago, leaner, perhaps, and with a quality in his eyes that had not been there before. Something sharpened. The silence in the room lasted 3 full seconds. Dr. Frederick made a sound that was not quite a word. Edward's expression went through several things very quickly: surprise, confusion, and then the one he could not manage to suppress entirely, something that was unmistakably fearful. "Edward," Adrian said. His voice was calm, the calm of a man who had decided what he was going to say several days ago and had spent the intervening time making sure he meant all of it. "You look as though you were expecting someone else." "I, of course not, Adrian, thank God." Edward moved forward, his face rearranging itself into relief. "We have been so worried. The reports, Frederick said the prognosis was—" "Sit down," Adrian said. It was said quietly, but something in the quality of it stopped Edward mid-stride, as if he had walked into glass. He sat. Adrian looked at Dr. Frederick. The physician had not moved from the doorway. His leather bag hung from his hand. His face was gray. "You as well, doctor," Adrian said. "There is a chair." What unfolded over the next 40 minutes was not a scene from a novel, though it would have made an extraordinary one. It was deliberate and methodical Adrian presenting, piece by piece, the evidence Eleanor had assembled: the vial, which she brought forward from the desk drawer where it had been waiting, the ledger, retrieved by Eleanor from the study, and the testimony of Eleanor herself, who stood at the side of the room and answered Adrian's questions in clear, unambiguous sentences. She described what she had smelled in the vial. She described the symptoms she had observed and their precise alignment with arsenic poisoning. She described each entry she had read in the ledger, including the date and the final notation. She did it without drama, without embellishment, without looking at Edward even once. She simply told the truth, which, as her father had told her long ago, does not need ornamentation. Edward attempted twice to interrupt. The first time, Adrian simply continued speaking as though he had not heard. The second time, Adrian looked at him with an expression that was not angry. It was something more final than anger, and Edward did not attempt a third. Dr. Frederick said nothing at all. He had recognized, in the first 10 seconds of seeing the empty vial in Eleanor's hand, that there was nothing left to say. When Adrian finished, he folded his hands on the desk in front of him and looked at his brother. "I want you to understand something," Adrian said. "I do not hate you. I find I cannot. You are my brother, and that is not a bond one know how to sever even now. But I want you to understand that what you have done and what you commissioned is not something I can absorb quietly into the family record and move on from. It will not be managed. It will be answered for." Edward said, in a voice stripped of all its usual performance, "Adrian, I had debts. I was desperate. I did not, I thought. You thought I would die and your problems would resolve," Adrian said. "Yes, I know what you thought." The sheriff arrived the following morning, escorted by 2 deputies. He had received Eleanor's letter 4 days prior, and had spent the intervening time consulting quietly with the county judge and waiting for the word Adrian's second letter, sent directly to the sheriff's office 2 days after Eleanor's had said would come. Dr. Frederick was taken first. He did not resist. He looked, if anything, relieved at the particular relief of a man who had been waiting for the consequence of a thing he knew he should never have done. Edward was taken second. Lady Beatrice, who had arrived the evening before in her own carriage, separately from Edward, which told its own story, was questioned at length and ultimately not charged with conspiracy, as the evidence placed the arrangement squarely between Edward and the doctor. She was, however, asked to vacate Thornfield permanently by the end of the week. She departed the following Tuesday morning without making eye contact with anyone. She left behind, Eleanor would later discover, a closet full of silk gowns and a drawer of love letters from a man who was not Adrian, which answered, with quiet finality, several questions no one had technically asked. The weeks after Edward's arrest had a quality that Eleanor could only describe, in her private thoughts, as the sound of a held breath finally releasing. Thornfield recovered slowly, the way living things do after damage, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily and with purpose. Several of the departed staff returned, drawn back by the news spreading through the county that the Duke was alive and well, and the contagion story had been manufactured. Some came back out of loyalty. Some came back out of embarrassment. Mrs. Helen, who had technically never left, accepted the news of Edward's arrest with the grim satisfaction of a woman who had suspected something was not right all along and simply been too frightened to say so. Adrian threw himself into the business of the estate with a focus that the household found both admirable and slightly unnerving. He reviewed every account ledger for the past 3 years. He discovered that Edward had been diverting funds, not only to Dr. Frederick bought several of his gambling creditors through falsified vendor invoices, a scheme that had been running quietly for so long that it had begun to look, on paper, like normal operation. He spent 2 weeks correcting it, filing the appropriate legal documentation, and working with a solicitor to ensure the estate's finances were restored and protected going forward. He also, and this part he did quietly, without announcement, drafted a new estate policy governing the wages and working conditions of the household staff. Minimum quarterly raises tied to cost of living, a formal grievance process, access to the estate's library for any staff member who wished to use it. It was not a revolutionary document, but it was a real one, and it was implemented. Through all of this, Eleanor continued her work at Thornfield. She had resumed her usual duties as the senior chambermaid, the position having opened somewhat inevitably, given the mass departure and incomplete return of the household. She moved through the days with her customary efficiency, and she thought about Adrian Velcourt, perhaps more than was entirely professional, and she dealt with this by being extremely thorough in her dusting. Adrian, for his part, was extraordinarily well-behaved for a man who found excuses to be in whatever room Eleanor was currently working in an average of 4 times per day. He needed a book from the library. He wanted to ask about the East Wing linen situation. He had a question about the garden calendar. He had another question, also somehow about linens. Mrs. Helen watched this with the expression of a woman who has seen everything and is not surprised by any of it, and went back to her soup. The conversation that changed things happened on a Thursday evening in December, 6 weeks after Edward's arrest, in the library. Eleanor was cataloging a shelf of volumes that had been returned from the study. Adrian walked in, did not pretend to need a book, and sat down in the chair across from the reading table where she was working. "I need to say something to you," he said, "and I would like to say it without being interrupted if possible, because I have rehearsed it a considerable number of times, and I am fairly certain any deviation will cause the whole thing to fall apart." Eleanor set down her pen. "All right. You saved my life. Not in the general sense in which one might say that to someone who helped during a difficult period. You saved it literally with your hands, with your knowledge, with 16 days of sustained effort in an empty house where you had absolutely no obligation to remain. I have been trying to find a way to adequately account for that, and I cannot. There is no adequate accounting, so I have stopped trying to find one." He paused, continued, "What I have found instead is that I do not want to account for it and move on. I would like," he stopped, ran a hand through his hair in the way he did when the formal version of himself ran out of script. "Eleanor, you are the most capable, honest, and interesting person I have encountered in my entire adult life. You think clearly when everything is on fire. You tell the truth even when it is inconvenient. You know the medicinal properties of plants that I could not identify from a botanical illustration, and you never once made me feel that my gratitude was owed to you rather than freely given, and I am quite thoroughly in love with you, which I recognize creates a situation that requires careful navigation given our respective positions, but I have decided I would rather navigate it directly than continue pretending that the reason I visit the library 4 times a day has anything to do with books." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she said, 5 times, actually. Yesterday it was 5. He blinked. Was it the linen question in the morning, the garden calendar at noon, the question about the east hallway lamp, the question about whether we had any particular volumes on Virginia agricultural history, and then the return visit to confirm that the lamp question had been resolved to your satisfaction?" "I see," he said. "I was not as subtle as I believed." "No," she agreed. "Not especially." A silence. Firelight. The sound of the house around them, quiet and settled. "Eleanor," he said, "I understand if the answer is no. I understand the complications. I am not asking you to dismiss any of them. I am only asking whether, among all the things you have decided in your life, most of them apparently wiser than the decisions anyone around you is making. You might be willing to consider this one. She stood up from the reading table. She walked around it. I stayed in this house, she said quietly, because I could not leave, and I have not been able to stop thinking about you since approximately the 7th day. When you asked me why I had stayed, and you listened to the full answer, without once looking toward the door. I am not unaware of the complications. I have been cataloging them quite thoroughly for 6 weeks. A pause. But I find that I am willing to navigate them. If you are. He stood up too. He reached for her hand carefully, as though asking permission, and she let him take it. Then we will, he said. They were married the following spring, on an April morning that came in warm and clear, in the small chapel on the eastern edge of the Thornfield grounds, with Mrs. Helen in the front row wearing her best hat and crying with complete unself-consciousness into a handkerchief she had borrowed from the groundskeeper. There was no grand announcement, no society column entry, no formal notification to the gentry families who had declined to attend Adrian's convalescing on the grounds of contagion concern and then sent congratulatory letters after the arrest of Edward, as if they had been supportive all along. Adrian sent each of those letters a polite, one-line acknowledgment and made no further effort. The household staff received the news with the subdued, knowing satisfaction of people who have been watching something come together for months and are very pleased to have been right about it. Mrs. Helen made a wedding cake with 4 layers, cited her niece as the reason it took 3 separate afternoons, and was not believed by anyone. Edward Velcourt was tried the following autumn. Dr. Frederick, in a decision that surprised no one who understood the mathematics of self-interest, agreed to testify in full in exchange for a reduced sentence. He testified with the meticulous detail of a man who had been keeping records of his own wrongdoing and now found them useful in a different direction than originally intended. Edward was convicted on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and financial fraud. He was sentenced to 12 years. He served 9. He wrote Adrian 1 letter from prison in the 2nd year. Adrian read it twice, wrote a 1-paragraph reply, and never discussed it with anyone except Eleanor. Beatrice remarried within the year to a minor diplomat in Maryland. She moved to Washington. By all accounts, she was much happier, and so was everyone who had known her previously. Thornfield, under Adrian and Eleanor's shared management, became something different from what it had been. Not less grand, but more alive. The library was open to the village on Tuesday afternoons, a practice Eleanor had suggested and Adrian had implemented without a second's hesitation. The staff wages were revised again, upward, 2 years after the initial policy. A small scholarship in Eleanor's father's name was established at the county school to fund the education of students who could not otherwise afford their books. None of it made the society pages. All of it made a difference. Eleanor Carter, Eleanor Velcourt, as of that April morning, continued to think clearly when things were on fire, to tell the truth even when it was inconvenient, and to dust the library shelves with the thoroughness of a woman who had earned every inch of the home she moved through. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be recognized for who they are. Eleanor had simply gotten on with being it, and somehow, without planning for it or expecting it or asking for it, the world had eventually arranged itself around her accordingly. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because if this story moved something in you, if Eleanor's courage made you sit up a little straighter, or Adrian's honesty made you feel something, then you already understand what great storytelling can do. It does not just entertain. It reminds you of something you already knew, but needed to hear again. So before we get to the outro, I want to ask you one thing. Subscribe to this channel right now and comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. We genuinely read those comments. We love knowing how far this story has traveled. And if you want to see how this all unfolds and what happens when the next story begins, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment. It helps more than you know. We will love to say hello to you. The halls of Thornfield are warm now. Not the curated warmth of a house maintained for appearances, the real warmth of a place that is genuinely inhabited, where the library smells of beeswax and old pages, and someone who loves books has clearly been recently by, where the kitchen is Mrs. Helen's undisputed kingdom, and the garden grows things that are useful as well as beautiful. Eleanor Carter walked into a dying man's bedroom with a basin of cool water and an unshakable sense of what was right. She did not save the Duke because she expected a reward. She saved him because she looked at the choice in front of her, the door out, or the chair beside the bed, and she knew, in the way some people simply know things, which one she could live with. That is the lesson here, if there is one to be taken. Not that loyalty is always rewarded. Sometimes it is not. Not that the truth always wins. Sometimes it arrives late. But the choices we make in the moments when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain and everything to lose, are the ones that define us most completely. Edward chose his debt over his brother's life. He carried the consequence of that choice for 12 years in a cell and a lifetime in his own memory. Dr. Frederick chose comfort over integrity. He spent his reputation on the only real currency a physician has and received a prison sentence in exchange. And Eleanor chose, with no audience and no certainty of outcome, to stay. She received a home, a partner, and a life built on something real. Choose integrity. Choose loyalty. Choose to stay when staying costs you something, because the things we build on honest ground are the only ones that last. Thank you for walking through Thornfield with us today. Stay kind, stay curious, and we will see you in the next story.